So I'll start again. I'm Tyler Klein. I'm the digital archivist here at the University of Wyoming and the head of digital programs at the American Heritage Center. This webinar is sponsored by the Wyoming SHRAB and broadcast online by a Wyocast from the University of Wyoming. And today I'm going to be talking to you about straightforward steps that you can take to begin managing your digital records. I'll start by defining digital records and laying out the similarities and differences between those and physical records, and how the differences between the two can impact your workflows. Then, I'll discuss common media types and how to transfer those records to secure digital storage for preservation and management. At the end, we'll have time for some questions. Many of you have already figured out the Wyocast question system. You can also email me at tyler.klein@uwyo.edu, and I'll be able to answer questions at the end of this presentation. So this webinar will give you practical tools to identify records that you may be working with. You'll be able to identify different types of physical media that records are stored on, know what common types of file systems have commonly been used on media. You'll be able to know where and how to acquire hardware to read media, and you'll be able to use preservation software to transfer, store, and describe your digital records. So first things first, what defines a digital record and what differentiates it from the physical? Digital records refer specifically to information that was created electronically. That's how the Society of American Archivists defines the term. And this differentiates born digital records from digital copies of scanned material. Digital records were created electronically and continue to be stored electronically. That means that they're not decipherable by the human eye. They require particular hardware and software to read, and thus their informational value is dependent upon a digital context. This is one of two main concerns surrounding digital records. The second concern is that of longevity. Paper records can last for decades, if not centuries, under the right storage condition. The same can be true for certain types of film and other audio-visual records. But the average lifespan of a CD or floppy disk is short. It could be anywhere from 5 to 10 years on the average. And that doesn't even take into account the failures in the manufacturing processes, particularly of CDs and DVDs, which can spontaneously manifest years after their manufacture, or could occur under poor storage conditions. Disk rot is the phenomenon most commonly associated with disk failure. They can also scratch easily, as anyone with a home music collection can recall, and disks exposed to high heat or humidity can flake. This causes irreversible loss of the data on those disks. Floppy disks could be considered even more fragile. Here's an illustration from the reverse of a disk dust jacket that I own from 1983. Any one of the actions that you see here could result in permanent data loss to the disk's information. Compound this with the operational lifespan of a computer file, which could also be short, anywhere from 1 to 5 years, depending on the program that it was created in. Computer software evolves rapidly, and newer versions of some software remove the capability to read older versions created by that software. These two factors mean that time is absolutely of the essence when you have digital records. Don't let them sit untouched for too long, or the data on them may be completely unreadable. The majority of archivists, records managers, and curators still primarily receive records stored on physical media. So, in order to preserve content found on those media types, it's helpful to be able to identify them. There are hundreds of different media types that have been manufactured over the last 4 decades for consumer use, and I'm going to cover some of the more prolific ones, many of which you'll likely be familiar with. Magnetic media is the most common type of digital media used in the 1970s through the 1990s. The most prolific type of magnetic media is the floppy disk. It's pretty ubiquitous. These 3 disk sizes seen here were used in personal computers, starting with the 8-inch floppy, the 5¼ inch floppy, and the 3½ inch disk. They could store between 120 kilobytes and 1.44 megabytes of data. For 3.5-inch disks in particular, several different types with different capacities exist, though they look almost identical. Early 3.5-inch disks are problematic in this respect, in that they can either be single or double density, meaning they could store either 400 kilobytes of data or 720 kilobytes of data. These do not have a perforation on the left side of the disk, which differentiates them from high density or high capacity 3.5-inch floppies that were introduced later and could store 1.44 megabytes of data. Zip disks and super disks were also popular during the late 1990s and very early 2000s. The zip disk was more prolific, with capacities of 100 or 250 megabytes, and later 750 megabytes. Super disks were popular with Mac users, particularly between 1998 and 2003, and had capacities of 120 or 240 megabytes. Hard disks began to be used by consumers around 1985, and are still the most common large capacity media in use today. Hard disks are typically found in two form factors, which you see here, 3.5 inches and 2.5 inches. And these hard disk drives usually use one of two types of connectors, SATA, or serial ATA, and IDE. IDE being the older type you'll see here with a pronounced set of pins, while SATA uses L-shaped connectors. Optical disks became popular in the late 1980s, and by 1993, most computers could read CD-ROMs. DVDs and Blu-ray discs became introduced later and are still popular for mass distribution of content, particularly video content. Though I'll mention a problem when trying to preserve these types of video discs are that these formats often contain a digital lock called digital rights management, which can make preservation difficult. Optical discs in general range in a capacity from 320 megabytes to 200 gigabytes, seen in the latest Blu-ray discs. Contemporary storage formats include USB flash or jump drives, and media cards like SD or micro SD cards, seen here. These have a capacity between 32 megabytes and 256 gigabytes. And solid-state drives also use flash-based storage. They can store up to 2 terabytes and have the same form factor and modern connectors as 2.5-inch hard drives. So now that you have a rough idea how to identify any physical media that you may have, you have a rough idea when the data on them might have been created, and generally the quantity that each disk could store. You'll also need to know a little bit about the file systems that these disks use. Basically, a file system is the way in which different types of computers organize and store information. For media created in the last decade or so, file systems used are likely interoperable between modern operating systems like Mac OS X, Windows, and Linux. Other file systems, such as FAT32, are readable on both Macs and PCs. The Macintosh file system generally is only readable on Macs and requires some particular software to use on PCs and Linux. But I will be discussing that later on in this presentation. When talking about older file systems, the differences are pronounced. When you try to read older media on modern computers, some file systems present more difficulties than others. Keep a note about what file systems you may be using on your media. If you can identify the more problematic formats like original Macintosh file systems or Apple II systems, you'll be prepared to address those during the preservation stage. Once you have a good idea what kind of media and formats that you may be working with, you'll need to get that media to talk with a modern computer. Now this may seem daunting, but most computers today are surprisingly backwards compatible with certain older hardware. As UW's digital archivist, I often acquire hardware from different places. 3.5-inch disk drives can be purchased new on Amazon, though I will note that they're manufactured a bit cheaper than they were in the 1980s and 1990s, manufactured in China as opposed to precision engineered in Japan. But these USB disk drives are plug and play with modern computers and can be read directly in Mac OS X and Windows. For hard disk drives, they usually use either the SATA or IDE connectors, as I mentioned, and you can buy connectors to these types of drives directly on Amazon. Like the one pictured here, they can connect to both 2.5 and 3.5 inch disk drives, and sometimes include both SATA and IDE. When you connect these to the computer, you can buy a cheap adapter that connects to all types of interfaces. Though it's important to note that these adapters do not provide power to the disk drives. You can purchase those power adapters separately on Amazon as well. I've also had a lot of success scouring eBay for older equipment, particularly 5.25 inch floppy drives. Many being sold on eBay today are still in new or good used working condition. And examples seen here are relatively cheap to acquire. If your organization has an IT department, don't hesitate to ask around to the folks there. And don't be afraid to scour local thrift stores. You might wonder about the provenance or quality of some of those finds, but what's important when you're dealing with floppy disks in particular is to acquire multiple copies of a disk drive. Even if one drive may be working perfectly, it may have quirks that prevent the full reading of the information on the disk. So sometimes swapping out drives is required when reading the information on a disk. For older floppy drives, 5.25 drives in particular, getting them to talk to computers presents a bit more of a challenge. There are two options being sold today by manufacturers that allow 5.25 inch disks to talk with modern computers. These two are the CryoFlux and the FC5025. They make a bridge, illustrated here, between the floppy disk interface and a modern USB connection. The FC5025 costs just $55 and is available to buy directly online. It includes software to image a disk on either Mac or Windows. And as you can see, it has a list of file systems that are supported to create those disk images. The CryoFlux, on the other hand, costs 99 euros and is available to buy online directly from Europe. It's a small board similar to the FC5025, but it has the added benefit of being able to capture the entire contents of a floppy disk. It also has the benefit of being able to read both 3.5 and 5.25 inch disks from the same card. It reads the disk by directly capturing the magnetic timing information or track information on the disk. And it saves it to a proprietary file. Once you've saved that file, you've captured that information, you can then interpret that into a disk image with readable files based on a list of supported file systems that the CryoFlux software has built in. For modern devices such as hard disk drives, you could plug those directly into a computer using the interface that I showed you earlier. But what you really want to do is get a forensic write blocker. These run around $200, and what they do is block any changes that the computer attempts to make to the media that you're transferring. This is a core concept of digital forensics. It's important to preserve the authenticity of the files on a disk. For example, if you were to plug in a hard disk drive directly to your computer, it may overwrite certain invisible files on the disk with new dates or other information that you would otherwise like not to have in order to preserve the disk's authenticity. So remember to get a forensic write blocker if you're dealing with hard disk drives. So with all of this in mind, I'll walk you through a simplified version of the workflow that I use for digital preservation. The Demystifying Born Digital series from OCLC lists 11 steps that you should take when preserving digital records. What I'd like to do is walk you through the steps of this process with the tools that I use in my department. Some of these steps will occur with the particular software that I'll be discussing, so I may not be naming each step separately. But the salient points here will be to transfer the files from one older media type that you have to a secure storage medium, authenticate those files, and create descriptive information about them for your own records. The first step in this process is to dedicate a computer for the purpose of digital preservation. The image seen here is an example of what you might need. You don't need a powerful computer. Any modern Mac or PC in the $500 to $800 range would do. What's important is that you maintain it in a clean state. We often call this a clean machine, And what that means is you have up-to-date antivirus software, a limited connection to the internet, and no extraneous programs installed. You also want to add peripherals, such as those I just discussed, to this computer as necessary for reading older media. Those could include a zip disk drive, floppy drive, a forensic write blocker, and one of the controller cards in the 5¼ inch disk drive. You might also want to have a USB hub for reading flash-based media. The second step is to make sure that your media won't be modified when you go to preserve the files. For optical discs like CDs and DVDs, I recommend using a disk drive that does not have a recording capability. Often you can find these on eBay as well. They will just be marked DVD drive, Blu-ray drive, not DVD recorder or Blu-ray recorder or rewritable. For memory cards, such as the one illustrated here, slide the right Protect tab down into the locked position. For floppy disks, 3½ inch disks in particular, slide the right Protect tab up so that the perforation hole is showing through. Many 3½ inch disks have a little lock or unlock icon on them so you can make sure that the disk is in the locked position. For USB devices, plug them into your forensic write blocker. Now, to transfer the media, you want to use a program called BitCurator. BitCurator is a free and open source suite of tools based on Linux that is maintained by the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and it can be installed as a virtual machine on basically any modern computer. It has free and open source tools for digital preservation that I'll discuss. In order to install BitCurator, download a virtualization program, such as Parallels or VMware. But if you don't have access to that, you can use the free and open source program VirtualBox, which is maintained and distributed by Oracle Software. It's a free download from virtualbox.org, and you'll also want to download the extension pack along with it. This will allow the BitCurator operating system to communicate with your computer. Next, download the BitCurator virtual machine file from bitcurator.org. It's about a 3 gigabyte download, and then uncompress it. You can do that using the built-in tools on a Mac or a program like 7-Zip in Windows. It'll uncompress 2 files, which will total about 8 gigabytes once uncompressed. And then you can open those files directly into VirtualBox. What I've shown here is an example of VirtualBox showing the BitCurator operating system and its settings. I've modified the settings here to use more RAM, about half of the memory that my computer has installed. This will allow it to perform its preservation actions quicker. We're also going to change a key setting in here, which I'll demonstrate, and add a shared folder so that any disks ingested into VirtualBox will be accessible on your computer's operating system. So click on the Settings gear in VirtualBox and go to the Shared Folders tab. There, you'll make a path from BitCurator to a folder on your computer that you'll monitor, or an external hard drive, or a server. This is where you'll be permanently storing the files that you're capturing. In this case, we'll go to the Shared Folders tab and add my computer's desktop folder here. From the pull-down menu, add the folder and select Auto Mount. This way, when you launch BitCurator, the folder on your computer's main operating system will appear. Here it is, appearing as a drive titled SF_desktop. And now that you have that configured, we're going to use BitCurator to generate a disk image, capture individual files, and generate a checksum. Following along with these steps, it's time to make sure that the media we insert is write protected. This will prevent any inadvertent changes to the data as we ingest it. Now, this is a core principle of digital forensics, as I mentioned. It was pioneered by the law enforcement community, but archivists and other information professionals use this to ensure that the authenticity of the records they're providing is maintained. So if you have a forensic write blocker, plug it in, and then plug in any media, like a hard disk drive or flash drive, into that. If you're using a CD or DVD, use a non-recording disk drive, or if you're using a 3.5-inch floppy disk, put the Write Protect tab up. Just to be safe, the BitCurator OS as well has a software write blocker, which you can enable from this menu in the top right-hand corner. The software write blocker should theoretically block any changes to the media, but it's not 100% foolproof. But if you do not have a forensic write blocker, be sure to enable this here in BitCurator. Now we'll create a folder on the BitCurator desktop with subfolders for each disk that we're going to ingest. In this case, I've given the folder's title a collection number, and the subfolder is the disk number that I've assigned to this disk. In this disk, test collection 001. I've also created subfolders for metadata and disk images, which will populate with files that we generate in BitCurator. The first thing to do when inserting a disk is to perform a virus scan. BitCurator has an antivirus program called ClamTK installed, and you can launch this program from BitCurator and scan the disk for viruses. Most likely you won't find any problems, but if you do, you can isolate the disk and its files and address them later. So assuming that you did not find any viruses on your disk, copy the files into the respective subfolder, the test collection 001 folder in this example. This will create an easy way to access the contents of each disk. Not all disks may display files here, and all the files here might not be operable with modern software. So we're also going to create what's called a forensic disk image. BitCurator has a built-in disk imaging program called Guymager, and using that program, you can copy all of the bits on a disk directly to a file called a disk image, including any deleted or hidden sectors on that disk. This forensic disk image is in what's called expert witness format. Again, it was originally developed for law enforcement, but it's useful for archivists practicing digital forensics. You can enter as much information here in Guymager as your workflow allows. Be sure to give the image a unique file name and enter that under the image file name field. You'll also want to check the checkboxes to generate MD5, SHA, and SHA-256 checksums. All of this information will be written to a companion text file alongside the disk image. Once that image is generated, Guymager will create this companion text file as well as a separate file showing the contents of the disk. The text file includes the checksums, which can help you verify the contents of the disk image stay consistent over time. And the other file generated, a CSV file, will list the directory structure of the disk, including file names, dates created, and file sizes. Store these in your metadata folder and store the .eo1 file in your disk images folder. This will help you come back to them later. I want to explain a little bit about checksums here for those of you who may not be familiar with them. What it is basically a digital fingerprint. It's a string of numbers calculated through the use of a particular algorithm that's generally unique to a specific file. The numbers correspond to attributes of the file. If any part of the file's data or bits change, the checksum would change. Once you calculate a checksum, such as the program Guymager does along with its disk images, it's important to record that information. You can store it in the text file, and you can also store it in a separate record. Later, you can check that number against the copy of the file to make sure that no information in that file has changed. If it has, you'll know that the file has been tampered with or corrupted in some way. The two most common algorithms used to generate checksums are MD5 and SHA-256. They're used by disk imaging programs like Guymager, as I mentioned, and other programs such as the Forensic Toolkit. Now, these are used by software to allow end users to verify that downloads they have or copies of files are accurate. Some information security professionals may tell you that these two common types of checksums, MD5 and SHA-1, are insecure or broken. Technically, that may be true, both of which are subject to mathematical exploit. And recent news articles have shown that the SHA-1 checksum is insecure, but it requires an enormous amount of computing power to break it. So as archivists and records managers and other professionals, you don't really have to change your workflows. You should worry about these exploits, but as long as you maintain control of the files that you have, you can use the checksum to verify their authenticity without fear of someone malicious changing them. So getting back to disk imaging, I want to take a moment here to talk about imaging Mac-formatted disks. Generally, Geimager cannot image Mac-formatted disks formatted in the HFS or HFS Plus file system. To image those, BitCurator does have a program called HFS Explorer, located in the Additional Tools folder in BitCurator. From this program, you can examine the files on an HFS disk created in Mac OS X. You can create a directory snapshot, just like Geimager does, and create a disk image. The caveats of this program, though, are twofold. One, it won't create a checksum automatically. And two, it can't read legacy HFS disks, that is to say, Macintosh formatted disks that were created before 1998. The best option to image disks created before 1998 on a Mac is to plug them into a modern Mac and use the built-in disk utility to create an image. Now, that is not a one-stop shop, but the option is still available for you. Now that you have the files, the disk image, and a checksum from a physical disk, you should record other pertinent information in a separate file. This can be a simple text file or fillable form, but it should include the following: a unique identifier for the disk, any information on the disk's physical label or jewel case, the date you created the disk image, what steps you took, and the checksum. An example of the form that I use is included here. At the American Heritage Center, we follow these steps when creating a disk. It contains fields to list the pertinent information about the disk you're preserving, and at the bottom are some further steps listing actions that you take when preserving a disk. The final step here is to copy your disk images to secure storage. This could be as simple as an external hard drive that you keep in a locked filing cabinet. It could be a networked drive that's backed up. It could be a RAID array, which is a series of hard drives in one physical location. But according to the best practices for digital preservation, you should make at least 2 copies to be stored in 2 different physical locations. 1 copy should be left alone as much as possible. This would constitute your dark archive or master copy. The other can serve as an access copy. If you do just make 2 copies, remember to only use the access copy when examining records for description, arrangement, further preservation, or access. If you were, for example, to convert older file formats on your access copy to modern file formats, you wouldn't overwrite your dark archive. And remember that it's okay to store multiple copies as well, more than 2. But start with 2, as that's fairly easily implementable. So that's the basics of Born Digital preservation. You want to have a successful migration of files, capture the relevant information, and create a forensic disk image. You'll also want to store these in different locations. What I'd like to do now is give you a quick demonstration of how this process works live. I'm going to switch over to our document camera here. It should come up as a separate option on your screen to use. What I've brought with me today is a forensic write blocker from Tableau Systems. These run about $200. What you'll see here, you've got basic power. You've got the option to connect it to your computer via either FireWire 400 or mini USB. In this case, we're using mini USB. And then on the other side, you've got a standard USB port to plug in any media that you may have. I will plug it in here. And you'll see it's showing line power. And we'll turn it on. I'll open up Bit Curator on my computer. So you see I have VirtualBox installed. And as we open up Bit Curator, we're going to take a standard USB drive, plug it in to our forensic write blocker. Forensic write blocker recognizes that a drive is inserted. And here in Bit Curator, once I plug the write blocker into my computer, the USB drive should appear. Here it is. As you can see, it's got a few folders on it. To prove that the forensic write blocker works, I will turn off the software write blocker and attempt to add some files to the disk. As you can see, it's not letting me, which shows that the write blocker is doing its job. Now that this is here, I can scan the disk for viruses using Geimager or using ClamTK, and image the disk using Geimager. It shows up here as generic flash disk. If I go acquire image, I can tell it to write a disk image to my computer's desktop in Bit Curator, and we'll call it test 1. Check the fact that it's calculating different checksums, and let it image this flash drive. Now, as you'll see back over here on the write blocker, there are lots of different pieces of information that the write blocker can show you. For example, it'll tell you whether or not it recognizes a file system on the USB disk. It'll give you the information about the forensic write blocker itself, which is important when verifying records. And back over here, in Bit Curator, it's still imaging the disk, but we'll see there are no bad sectors detected, meaning that the disk image created will be an authentic copy of the information. This can often be a slow process. I'm using a 900 megabyte disk in this example, but for many DVDs or Blu-ray discs or hard drives, this process could take an hour or 2 or 4 or 8. So patience is often important in this process as well. But now that it has completed the disk image, you'll see some files were created here. The EO1 file, which is the forensic disk image itself, and the .info file, which includes information about how the disk image itself was created. Down here, you'll see strings of information, and these are the actual checksums. And these, as I mentioned, are important to record in separate locations. That's the basics of it. When you're done, you can power off your forensic write blocker. And repeat. So, I've saved some time for a question and answer period. Some of you have already tried out the Wyocast comment feature. You can also email me at tyler.klein@uwyo.edu. So I'll take some time to answer questions now. Let's see. So some of you may not have been able to see the projector or computer screen as I was copying that. All three should be recorded as this was going along. We can double check that after the fact, of course. Let's make sure that BitCurator is displaying. Try switching the active view of your presentation here. So one person asks, will the text and PDF of this presentation be available after the fact? I can certainly make that available. The slides themselves will also be available through Wyocast. As you go along with the recording, you'll be able to see the slides and hear the audio of this. I'm also happy to take any more questions as we go along here. We have a bit of extra time, so please ask away. I'll also put up some useful hyperlinks here to the tools that I've mentioned, including VirtualBox, BitCurator, and the Demystifying Born Digital series, which is worth reading in its entirety, although it is the first part of this three-part series that illustrates the steps that I was demonstrating to you today. We can also put this back up on both projectors. Maybe. There we are. Useful links for everyone to have. So if there aren't any questions, I can run through the BitCurator demonstration again for those of you who may have missed it or could not see it on their screen. Maybe. So here we have BitCurator. If we want to show that. It's not working. Let's see if this shows up. So let me run through the demonstration of creating a forensic disk image one more time. So if I plug in a USB device to a forensic write blocker, it will show up in BitCurator as an external disk or volume. From there, you can scan that external disk or volume with CLAM, the virus scan tool. Scan each folder to make sure that there are no viruses on it. and then open up Geimager to create a forensic disk image. So I've received one question, and the question is, have you ever encountered a problem while using a forensic write blocker? Not when using it as intended. There are multiple versions of forensic write blockers that are manufactured and sold. Some only work with a particular kind of media. For example, the write blocker that I have here only works with USB media. So it'll work with flash drives or memory cards or some hard drives with an adapter. It won't work, for example, if you were to plug in a USB floppy drive to the write blocker. It would not recognize that, nor would it recognize a zip disk drive plugged into the write blocker. You would have to buy a different type of forensic write blocker for that. And the company that makes this one, the Tableau forensic write blocker, makes a whole computer system called FRED, which stands for Forensic Recording Evidence Device, I believe, which costs around $5,000 and can basically provide write blockers for any type of media. But when using it correctly, I haven't run into any problems yet. It's easily recognized both by Mac and Windows and also recognized by BitCurator itself. Another question asks, should we be concerned with the type of checksum, MD5 versus SHA? And my professional opinion is no, not in this field. SHA-1 is more secure than MD5, and SHA-256 is more secure than SHA-1. But like I kind of mentioned in my presentation, unless you have reason to believe that someone may be hacking into your files and changing them and then modifying them in such a particular way that the checksum value would stay the same, you should not worry. And an MD5 checksum is fine to use under these circumstances. So in Geimager, you'll want to acquire your disk image, save it somewhere convenient like on the desktop, give it a name like a unique identifier, and you can calculate all the checksums, and it will create that file on your BitCurator desktop. I'm not sure if people were not seeing that before or if you need to switch screens, but it will be in the recording. Well, if anyone has any further questions, you can feel free to email me at tyler.klein@uwyo.edu, and I will write you back. Other than that, we're going to end this webinar. Thank you, everyone, for watching.